All right, we're rolling. Alec is here joining us, and you are, from what I have come to learn, probably the longest standing true hybrid athlete on the planet, or one of them for sure. Hybrid training is getting a ton of attention, especially in like some certain circles, and I would say as a result of Nick Bare and like the Bare Performance Nutrition world, like he's really put a big spotlight on hybrid training, and a lot of people are talking about it, but you've been doing this for a long time. So you have more insight from experience of doing it yourself and from coaching. And today we want to know, because a lot of people are dipping their toes into hybrid training, what are the 5 most common mistakes that you see with hybrid athletes or people who are dipping their toe into hybrid athletics?
For sure. I'm super excited to talk about it. With any kind of new trend, there's always people that have something to say, something, haters talking about, I've been doing hybrid training forever, it's just strength and conditioning, all that kind of stuff. But I'm personally thrilled to see it kind of catch on in the way that it has, just because for years, right, people were afraid that cardio was going to kill their gains, or they thought they couldn't pursue both strength and endurance to the level that I think is possible, and now we see a lot more people doing. So I'm thrilled that it's caught on, thrilled to be here talking about it. I do see people make a lot of mistakes though, and I think one of the biggest ones, probably the biggest one that I see, is people see, high-level athletes, influencers, etc., who have been doing this hybrid thing for a while. They see people doing, powerlifting meets and running marathons like back-to-back, these super cool things. And they're like, I want to do that. Yeah. And they jump into someone else's version of a hybrid program, and they rush into it. They do too much too soon. They think they can just mash together their bodybuilding program and some marathon plan they found online, and it ends up being way too much. They get burnt out, fatigued, exhausted, injured, whatever happens. And they're like, I tried the hybrid thing, it doesn't work for me. But I would encourage people, like, slow way down, take that beginner's mindset, and don't try to do hybrid in the way that I do it or Nick Bare does it or that anybody else does it. Find a way that you can make hybrid work for you. And that often means going a lot slower and being a lot more patient with it.
So what are those signs that somebody is, well, aside from just picking, that's, I liken that to when I was a teenager and I went and tried to do Ronnie Coleman's bodybuilding program at the gym. And I was like, oh, he's doing 20 sets of chest today, and I'm going to go try and do that. And then, of course, I was young and like wasn't making progress and wasn't eating enough and wasn't doing anything and wasn't taking anabolics and whatever he was using as well. So it wasn't right for me. So aside from just grabbing a hold of like some elite hybrid athletes program and that being like a red flag, like that's probably not right for you, what are the signs that somebody's maybe doing too much too soon? Yeah,
so there's what I would call the brute force approach, which is just do all of the training and see what happens. And I think if you have a couple of kind of factors in place, a couple lifestyle factors, if you're on the younger side, if you're sleeping well, if you're eating well, if you have a decent athletic base behind you, I think that brute force method of just do all the training, eat all the food, sleep all the hours, it can work up to a point, but I don't think that's realistic for most people. I think most people have to be a little bit more strategic in terms of, where are they going to put their effort? Are they being specific and targeted about addressing their weak points?
Sure.
And I think the biggest kind of red flag or area that people mess up and do too much is just too much cardio volume too soon.
Okay.
I think a lot of people that get into the hybrid space now, they come from a strength and power background or they come from a lifting background and they want to add cardio into their program and they forget what it's like to be a beginner. They are an intermediate or an advanced strength athlete. They're used to things feeling pretty easy. They're used to training, couple hours a week, however much training volume they're putting in, and they expect to just pick up running the same way. Whereas, you might start with just run a mile and see how you feel.
Sure.
And most people, if you're even a beginner runner, I think a lot of runners have this mindset of like, it's not a run unless it's 3 miles or 20-minute minimum or whatever. And I think if you are just a pure runner, it's pretty easy to ramp to some of those targets pretty quickly. But if you're not your typical, 140 pound runner, if you're a 200 plus pound lifter, right, and you go for that same short run, that's going to beat you up a whole different way. So I would encourage people, like, keep an eye on some performance metrics. If you are starting to add running into a program, if you're adding cardio into a program, watch how your lifts respond. A little bit of kind of, I would expect to see a slight depression or kind of pullback in some of your lifting performances, but it shouldn't be drastic. So if you're used to squatting X amount of weight, you add in conditioning 1 week, I would make sure that you're still hitting 90 to 95% of that. If you see a 20% drop in your lift performance when you add cardio or you add more cardio, you probably did too much. It shouldn't be that big of a fatigue hit. So just keep an eye on some of those things. If you see a big drop like that, it's not a bad thing you didn't screw up. Just take a second, be patient, pull back, pull the volume back, hold there a couple weeks, wait for your lifts to kind of restabilize, and then you can push again. So just kind of taking that approach of see what happens with your performances, be patient, adjust. If you do get excessively fatigued, don't freak out or think that you've made this huge error. Just pull back and wait a little bit longer, and you're probably going to be fine.
Now you're talking about, the example you just gave and the context that you're using is you're a lifter and you want to add cardio in, which is, I take it, what you see most of these days, right? More people in the strength and power world are thinking, okay, I want to get into this hybrid training and add cardio. Do you have any advice? Not that our general listeners probably in that camp, but from somebody who's like, I'm an aerobic person and I want to start adding in, power sports or lifting or Olympic lifting or, something on that direction of hybrid.
Yeah, for sure. Definitely less common. Like I said, I see more of the kind of lifters getting into cardio, but you definitely see the opposite as well. The good news for those people is generally when you have like a really good aerobic base, really strong aerobic system, your recovery is going to be that much better. Yep. You kind of have more margin of error where you push a little bit too hard, you're going to bounce back a little bit quicker, I think. Mm-hmm. You're also not typically just as big, strong, powerful. You're not, basically producing as much muscle damage from any given session. Yes. So I feel like the margin of error is much better. The problem I see with that group of people is more of a psychological thing where they hate their running taking a hit. They go out for a run, their legs are sore. Yeah. They can't handle it. Like, they can't handle that their paces were 10 seconds slower that day.
Oh gosh.
It's just this it's just terrible for them. So my encouragement for those people is you are going to be a little bit fatigued. Kind of like I said with the previous group, keep an eye on your performances. If we see a huge performance dip, you probably overdid it a little bit. Yep. But you have to be willing to kind of get over that hump and be a little bit sore, be a little bit tired, not be at 100% for every workout, but maybe 90, 95%. And that's going to be okay. So that's my biggest piece of advice to them. They have a lot going for them. I think that general work capacity really works in their favor. They just have to be willing to slow down a little bit, at least a couple days a week. We can talk more about, how do you schedule a program optimally and so on.
Yeah, that's a whole episode in itself.
It's a whole episode.
Yep.
But I generally recommend, especially on like easy runs, if you run your easy runs a little bit slower, you're still getting the vast majority of the benefit. Cool. If you can try to figure out when in the week do you want to be fresh for your key sessions, try to arrange your schedule so you can still hit a few key workouts feeling as fresh as possible. But if you got to be a little bit sore, a little bit tired for some of those easy workouts, that's fine. Don't freak out. Be willing to slow down. Be willing to again, be patient with letting your legs catch up a little bit.
Cool. Yeah. I have experience with both of those in my coaching career. I was coaching a lot of CrossFit, and then we got these ultra runners that were coming in, and it was amazing. One thing I noticed with some of the ultra runners is, they just have this tremendous capacity, and because of their aerobic base, they would recover. The other thing is that they had going for them was that because they were so aerobically trained, it was difficult for them to switch into like giving a ton of intensity with weight training. It was almost like you had to kind of overly like, hey, you got to work a little harder.
They're always holding something back.
They're always holding something back. Yeah. They're like, they understand pacing, I suppose. And I think also just like whatever muscle fiber types that they had overly developed from aerobics, like they just couldn't express as much power. Whereas you get a strong, powerful lifter and you tell them to go run, like they can produce a lot of force. They can go and do some serious damage with a 2 mile run, or a 3 mile run. So that's, it's like you said, I think it is easier for that individual. Like me, we were just talking about this downstairs. Like I'm adding in 1 run a week because I'm interested in getting into some hybrid training and maybe running, a race at some point. I just have to be more mindful. It's like I'm 185 pounds. I have great muscle tone and strength. I could go and brute force, a 10-mile run today for sure. I could do it, but would that set me back and really be the optimal thing for me? So number one, doing too much too soon. And I think it leads really well into your second point, which is this idea of like patience, right?
Yeah. And having a beginner's mindset. We talked about it a little bit, but I think when you're an intermediate to advanced athlete, there's certain things about programming that become more important. Whereas when you're a beginner, it's kind of just do the basics, right? And when you get more advanced, you can start thinking about, the nuance a little bit more. And I think the mistake that people make with hybrid is when they're adding like a second discipline. So if they're a strength athlete adding cardio or vice versa, they might be used to kind of chasing some of that nuance and trying to squeeze out like making things optimal and kind of making those subtle tweaks. Where they're such a beginner, they just got to nail the basics first. Mm-hmm. So I think too often hybrid athletes or newer hybrid athletes, they'll make things way too complicated and they're trying to get this perfect program and fine tune every single workout versus just checking some basic boxes of like, are you doing an appropriate number of just total aerobic hours per week? Is your training volume appropriate? Do you have a decent balance of easy, medium, and hard training? Doing things like that before you worry about, should I be resting 60 or 75 seconds between my 400-meter repeats?
Yeah.
That's not the thing that you need to be focusing on right now, and I think that can sometimes distract people from some of those big basics. So that kind of completes the second point of have that beginner's mindset, focus on the fundamentals of cardio or the fundamentals of strength before you try to make everything too complicated all at once.
Now somebody's going to listen to this and they're going to be like, oh, I know that. I know how to be a beginner. I know how to like be patient. And unfortunately, for many experienced lifters or people who have an experience in one discipline, they're like, their time horizon for what being a beginner is like way too short. It's like, okay, I'm going to go be a beginner for 3 months. Exactly. So, like from somebody who's done this and coached people, what is like, let's say I'm me, I've got over a decade of lifting, good lifting, proper lifting. I'm pretty advanced in that discipline and I want to start running. How long should I really be thinking beginner mindset? Is this months? Is this weeks? Is this years? Where do I start to, how can I start to like protect myself by just putting like a timestamp like, hey, for the next year, don't complicate, or, how would you take that?
Yeah, that's a great point and a great question. I would encourage someone like yourself to reflect back on where were you 1 year into your lifting career, right? Yeah. And how would you think about, were you a beginner, an intermediate, or an advanced athlete at year one for your primary sport? And you'd probably be like, well, obviously a total beginner. Like I didn't know what I was doing, whatever. People are very willing to look back and be like, yeah, that was totally a beginner then. But it's hard to apply that to today. You think you have this special knowledge, right? You're like, oh, I've been through this. I can become an advanced athlete in a year. But you can't rush it. Like there's no real shortcuts to it. I think there's some, subjectivity with defining terms like beginner, intermediate, and advanced. But I would say for the first 1 or 2 years, really embrace that beginner's mindset and don't try to rush into, overcomplicating things, worrying about advanced training techniques, intensity techniques, like in the gym doing, drop sets or lengthened partials, like some of these trendy kind of things. Like if you've only been training for 6 months, you probably don't even need to know what those terms are, right?
Yep.
And I would say the same thing with running workouts. Like you don't need to know what a cut down repeat is if you've been running for 6 months. You just need to go get some miles in, do some hard intervals, rest between them till you feel good. You don't have to worry about exact work to rest ratios. You don't have to worry about blending different intensities just right into a single session. You just need to do some hard work, some medium work, some easy work. Make sure that your total volume is appropriate. And that's where I'd focus the bulk of your attention for your first year or so.
Yeah. And then maybe I would add one thing, which is like, not just embrace the beginner mindset, but also see the value in being a beginner, right? Because like the newbie gains that you got when you were strength training, like those are there to be had as a endurance athlete, I would imagine. And it's like in that first year, you're probably going to make the bulk of your progress if you just don't fuck it up and try and go too hard too quickly.
Well, to add on to that, like with endurance training, I think there's where people struggle with patience is they want to ramp up their volume really quickly. So they see what other athletes are doing. You know, they look at, say, some intermediate to high level hybrid athlete who's running 60 miles a week, right? And they start and they're like, the sooner I can get the 60 miles a week, the sooner I'm going to be like this person. Right? Whereas I would encourage people, like, you want to give yourself a long runway for improvement, and you don't want to apply the stimulus of volume before it's necessary. So in terms of like increasing training volume, I kind of take that as not as a last resort, but I explore other ways to get you fitter first before I just say, okay, let's throw more volume at you. So if you're running, or we'll make it more general, if you're doing 3 hours of cardio a week, I want to see how fit can we get you on 3 hours a week before we explore 4. I don't want to just say, let's just do 4 to do 4, you know, if there's still progress to be made on 3, because one day you're going to need 4. You know, and I don't want to force you into that before you really need it. I want to extend that runway as much as possible.
Beautiful. Yeah. Okay. That's so number 1, too much too soon. Number 2, not being patient and not embracing the beginner's mindset. Talk about number 3, efficiency.
Yeah. So with any sort of hybrid training program, there's a lot going on, right? Especially if you're like doing, you know, CrossFit, for example. If you're doing Olympic lifting, some hypertrophy work, you got like 5, 6 different sports really kind of jumbled there into one. You're adding even another one on top of that. Especially if you're doing like triathlon, geez, you can end up with so much going on in a program. You really want to be as efficient as possible with all of that work and not have unnecessary overlap, kind of redundant training stimuli in a program. And you don't want to have what I loosely call junk volume of, you know, things that your time could be better spent doing something else. There's a couple things that if you're a single sport athlete, I think are totally fine. But when you become a hybrid athlete and you're juggling strength and endurance at a high level, certain things just aren't worth the investment. One of those that I might get some flack for this is like what I call recovery workouts. Recovery runs, for example, recovery rides, things that are extremely low level, just like barely pedaling on the bike, for example. I think for most people, that's okay. But if you're juggling a huge hybrid training program, you're trying to run a marathon, you're trying to train for powerlifting, you have so much time invested in your training program already. What is that 20-minute block doing for you that you're not already getting from your very high activity level, 2 workouts a day, maybe 3 workouts a day? To me, it just doesn't make sense to say, I need to set aside even more time, more mental energy for this workout that isn't really eliciting much of a stimulus. So I tend to stay away from like zone 0, I call it, zone 0, zone 1, like really, really easy recovery rides. I try to stay away from excessive warm-ups and cool-downs. If a little bit feels good, if you like to shake out the legs, that's fine. But you know, if you got a full 60 to 90 minute lift, 60 to 90 minute endurance training session, I don't want to ask another 30 minutes of you just warming up and cooling down and not necessarily doing a whole lot. So really trying to be as efficient as possible with your time so you can get your workouts done and then go rest and go eat and move on with your life kind of thing. Whereas again, if you're only training for one sport, another 10, 15 minutes added on is not going to kill you. It's just way less practical when you're juggling so much.
And I think also, I mean, you're kind of talking about, so somebody who's a hybrid athlete or who wants to approach doing really well in multiple disciplines, and they have the time to invest. You know, that's one subset of the population out there. But there's a growing subset that is like everyday working class people who just like, they only have their 5 or 6 hours a week at best to train. And they're like, I want to be a hybrid athlete. So it's even probably more important in that group to be like, look, you only got 5 hours. So why add in, like, there's so much value you can get out of those 5 hours if you stick to really efficient training and get rid of sort of like these excessive warm-ups, these added recovery rides. And it's like, no, you got your 5 hours. Let's make them the most productive that they can be.
Exactly. And I'll often get people will push back and be like, well, you know, blah, 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 Tour de France riders doing recovery rides. I'm like, you're not a Tour de France rider.
Yeah, right.
You don't have 6, 7, 8 hours to ride your bike per day.
Yeah, you're a CEO. You're like a working parent who's got 3 kids, and like you don't need that.
Exactly. It's all about efficiency, and I find that there's certain types of workouts that not that you can't do them both, but there's some redundancy and some overlap between things you can do in the gym and like say like a bike sprint or sprinting. And I don't like to see people double down essentially. So oftentimes in a single workout, if I'm working with a cyclist, I might have them do some squats and some bike sprints in the same day. I don't like to see someone do like a 10 by 10 squat workout and try to do some crazy like high volume, like 10 by 4 minute all out bike sprint. Mm-hmm. That is just so much of potentially not identical, but somewhat overlapping stimuli. So when I see an opportunity where there's things that are, again, not identical, but similar, those are areas where I'm going to try to be a little bit more efficient. So maybe just cutting the volume down on both of those things since they support each other so well. Whereas if there's something that's a little bit more unique that they're not getting in the gym, like their low intensity zone 2 work, you're not getting that in the gym. So we can do as much of that kind of as you want and like really prioritize that. Whereas when it comes to like short, 30-second sprints for speed and power, there's a little bit of overlap with that and some of the like speed and power work you might be doing in the gym. So I don't want to give you too much of both of those things, or it can become excessive. So I might apply a slightly lower volume of those types of sessions if I'm giving you both of them, if you're trying to work on both of those things simultaneously.
Great. Okay. Number 4. What's your 4th most common mistake?
4th most common mistake is letting what's optimal get in the way of what's practical. So a lot of times when people start talking about hybrid training, there's a lot of discussion about what's the best way to arrange your schedule. How do we avoid the interference effect that people are worried about? They'll talk about like enzymes and metabolic pathways and AMPK and mTOR and like all these things. And they'll be like, separate your sessions by 3 hours, or this pathway is going to be disrupted, and so on and so forth. And, I'll say there's a time and place for those discussions, but like you brought up, just kind of the working class hybrid athlete that can work out an hour a day or so, most people don't have the luxury of being able to program what is optimal in the first place. They just got to get the work done. And I hate seeing people worry so much about things like that they end up not doing a session. They're like, I'm not going to lift today because I had to run first and I don't want my lift to be bad. So I'm going to push it off to tomorrow when my legs are a little bit more fresh. It sounds good. Like it sounds like a reasonable argument to make. But I think for a lot of people, it just means they end up training a lot less than they could if they just said, screw it. I know it's not perfect, but I'm just going to get the work done. So for most people, optimize where you can. But the most important, single most important variable in this hybrid athlete discussion is, are you getting the work done? And if trying to optimize these variables ever starts making you skip workouts or training less than you probably would have otherwise, you're probably not really optimizing. You're just tricking yourself into training less.
And I also think too, it's not just about like, if the mentality makes you, you make a decision based upon this, like I'm trying to be optimal, and then you skip training. There's also the pitfall of, oh my gosh, this isn't optimal. And you're in your head while you're doing the work and you're thinking, oh gosh, this isn't as good as it could be. Yeah. And we run into that too, even within our Persist, program that we have and subscribers. They'll hit a Saturday session which had some pushing in it, and then on one day of rest, maybe not the best rest day because they did something big on a Sunday, it was the weekend, they come back on Monday and it's got some more pushing, and they're like, well, this has got pushing too, I'm still sore and this isn't optimal, and they get into their heads a little bit. And yeah, we could try and optimize the schedule and organize it, but it's not going to be right for every single person. Right. And at the end of the day, it's work, and you're not going to be doing push on Saturday and Monday for the rest of your life. Yeah. Take advantage of this opportunity to just go in and do the best you can on that day, given whatever fatigue you might have or however the run is maybe impacting the lift. Just do it. Well,
especially when in a hybrid program where you have so many things going on at once, when you try to optimize for one thing, like, you got two pushing workouts a little too close together, right? You're like, okay, we're gonna optimize that. We're gonna flip these sessions around. Now all of a sudden something else is wrong.
Yes, precisely.
So like there's gonna be something that's not perfect about your program.
Yeah.
You can't have a program that's completely perfect.
Yes.
So I'm just kind of embracing that imperfection and being like, it's okay. It's gonna make me, whatever you want to tell yourself, it's going to make me tougher, whatever.
Yeah.
But like, there's something that's not going to be perfect. So you just kind of have to go with it at some point.
Yeah. Becoming a hybrid athlete or becoming a better athlete or just challenging yourself physically is, there's a mental, growth that happens there too. There's a lot of ways that you can kind of say like, well, this wasn't perfect, but hey, today's going to be a mentally tough day and I'm going to build mental resilience this way. And I think that, maybe even to a fault, like because I got such a foundation in my coaching career through my CrossFit experience. I mean, CrossFit was just, we did everything all the time, and it was like, I was squatting 6 days a week almost, it seemed like, or doing knee flexion, right? And it was like, was that optimal? No, but we kind of stuck with it. And on the other side of that was just a massive amount of work capacity and strength that was gained, and ultimately just this tons of resilience. So you can see and that wasn't just brute forcing it. That was just still approaching each day to the best of my ability within my limits and not always trying to push it further, but accepting that like, hey, you know what? We had to train for a sport where there could be 3 events in a row where there was squatting. It's like, okay, well then let's just go with it. And you can still make great progress both mentally and physically. And
we'll talk about this concept in another segment, I think a little bit more, but I hate seeing people nocebo themselves. So nocebo meaning you think that something is harmful, so then it becomes harmful. So I think a lot of times people have this idea that cardio kills your gains, or you need to be, well fueled for every session, or you can't be sore going to a session, or all these bad things happen. And there's shreds of truth to all these things, but I think people focus on them so much that then they find themselves in a situation where there is something that's not optimal about their program, and then it gets to them.
Yeah.
And then they get into the session, they're like, oh, I knew this session was going to suck, whatever. Totally. Whereas like, just take the approach that it's going to make you better in some way. And I think you can avoid some of that like self-nocebo.
Yeah. And I, maybe just to like wrap this point up, and maybe you probably feel the same way, but I can't recall a single program that I've ever done in my life that was so perfectly balanced, where every day I walked into the gym or I walked out onto the track or I walked into whatever I was doing, and I was like, yeah, I've gone 100 days in a row, and every day I have felt ready to go, and there's no overlap or no, confounding variables here.
Yeah. Well, that's the next point, is that you don't have to feel perfect for a session to be effective.
Yeah. We're rolling right from one to the next. So number 5 is thinking you have to feel perfect all the time.
Yeah. And this applies to everyone, hybrid athlete or not, like you were saying. I think that there's a little bit more background fatigue that you just carry with you all the time as a hybrid athlete, because you're probably doing, maybe not every day, some people every day, some people most days, but you're doing a lot of, low intensity cardio throughout the week. You have more training volume overall. So there's just this level of background fatigue, and you're doing more total work. So you wake up for a session, you're still tired from the run you did yesterday or whatever it is. And I think there's a temptation to want to, to the previous point, make everything so optimal that you feel perfect and just like ready to go hard every single time. Whereas I think if you are a hybrid athlete, there's going to be fewer days that you feel 100%. I don't want you to feel like trash. I don't want people to take this message and be like, oh, just like feel like crap all the time and recovery doesn't matter. And like, I don't want you to take it that far. But instead of trying to feel 100% all the time, try to be, good enough as often as you can. Sure. You don't need perfect training sessions. You need sessions that are good enough. And, defining that can be tricky, whether that means you need to feel at least 80% each day or 90% each day, is a little bit subjective. But it's really about stringing together as many good enough sessions as possible. I would much rather you train good enough 7 days a week than perfect 2 days a week, skip 2 workouts and have 2 bad workouts. Yeah. I'd rather just have that string of good enough consistency.
Do you have, this might be challenging and maybe you don't, but is there something that you can you give to clients where you say like, hey, use this kind of self check-in to let one example of this is like when people are experiencing pain, we like to use like the 3 out of 10 scale. Like if training feels like more than a 3 out of 10 on the pain scale, then let's skip that movement.
Yeah.
Or when it comes to like hybrid athlete training, it's like, hey, if you go into your training session and you feel this way, then yes, maybe it is a good time to take an extra rest day.
I love the 3 out of 10 pain scale. I do have a couple of those things. I encourage people not to think about how they feel just when they roll out of bed too much, right? Mm-hmm. There's something to be said for listen to your body. But I think if you listen to your body at the wrong times, it's always going to tell you to sleep in.
Sure.
Right? Yeah. So figure out like when do you listen and when do you ignore it,
yeah,
right?
The number of days I woke up when I was training for CrossFit that I was like, oh, never going to be able to do this session today. And then you get moving and you're like, oh, I'm actually...
Exactly. So I tell people get moving first.
Yeah.
Like don't make any decisions until you get moving. Go to the gym, start warming up, see how you feel. We can make some decisions once we get to that point. More often than not. I find there's some basic, just like kind of performance tests, things you can do as part of a brief warm up, an activation set, if you will, things like that, where you can see what's your performance today, how does that reflect your training readiness and your recovery state, and then we can make some decisions based off of that. I find some basic strength and power work, sprints, explosive jumps, things like that. We can warm up to a hard effort, see where you're at for the day, and if you're below a certain baseline that you've set for yourself, then my training readiness is bad. I should probably pull back, make some adjustments. So a very simple one would be just like a standing broad jump for distance. Mm-hmm. Get warmed up, do 5 minutes on the air bike, whatever your kind of deal is to get some blood flowing. Give yourself 3 attempts at a max effort broad jump, set a baseline. So you can broad jump 90 inches or so as like your running baseline. I'd say any given day, if you're getting within 10% of that target, so if you usually jump 90 inches, if you're somewhere in that like 81 to 90 inch, range on any given day, just send it, see what happens.
Cool.
If you warm up, you get going, you do a broad jump and you jump like 70 inches and you're like, shit, this is, this is probably a time to make an adjustment, maybe make today a deload day, something like that. Cause if you're warming up, if you've warmed up and that's still where you're at, you're still only getting that on like a broad jump for distance, I don't think you're going to be able to perform at a level that's going to elicit the adaptation we're going for today. Yeah. So either make it a deload session, a day just for some like zone 2 cardio. There's some logistical constraints of like how you move your schedule around. Yeah. Some people, they're stuck with this like, I got to do upper body, lower body on X days because of my schedule. So if that's you, maybe just make it a deload workout. If you have more flexibility to just kind of do whatever session whenever, maybe just push the workouts back and do an easier like zone 2 cardio session that day. So there's a couple of ways to approach it, but you can do a standing broad jump. You can do a peak power, like get on the air bike, 10-second sprint for peak power, full recovery, 3 attempts, see where you're at. And I'm usually going for, can you hit at least 90% of your baseline? Mm-hmm. If so, go for it. If not, back off. Yeah. And if you hit like a PR that day, then like you're probably primed for a good session.
Yeah. That's great. Yeah. And these are, for our listeners and these are just like ways to sort of see where your nervous system is at on a given day.
Right.
I used to have kind of like a similar test that my coach kind of taught me back in the CrossFit day. It's like taking double unders, which is kind of like a skill you kind of need to be sharp at. It's like go pick up the jump rope and do a set of 50 double unders, time yourself. And it's like if you trip 5 times, but your baseline is like, you can just nail this, like, okay, something's not firing right. I'm a little bit off, but, yeah, they're good little self-tests, and I love this list, and I think this is important for a lot of people to listen to. I hope a lot of people get to hear who are interested in hybrid training, but there's also a lot of lessons to take from this, just general training principles. So awesome for laying that out for us. Alec, where can people find you and learn more from you?
For sure. You can find more of me on my Instagram at Alec Blenis. Feel free to comment, send me messages. I do a Q&A pretty often on my stories, so keep an eye on that if you have questions. I always love helping people out there.
Cool. Well, thanks for joining us for this episode, and there are a couple more nuggets coming your way, so stay tuned for more.
Thanks.